Okay, I think we'll get started. We're seeing people join into the session here. So just to say welcome to everybody who's joined us for this conversation. My name is Antonia Gavel. I head climate change at the World Economic Forum, and it's my pleasure to chair this conversation where really the objective here is to get some further insights and experiences from some guests that we have on the line with us here who are leading chairs with deep experience in engaging in the boardroom and with chairs around the world as well in really bringing climate change to the fore of the agenda. Just to kind of frame the context of this session a little bit, I and at the World Economic Forum have been deeply engaged in trying to drive this agenda for a number of years now. With the initiation of what we designed as principles to support leaders think through how they really integrate board decision making, sort of climate change into board decision making. We started launching principles for climate governance in 2019, and really from there spurred the Climate Governance Initiative, which is very much, obviously, as you know, at the core of hosting this summit that you're participating in today. I think what's been really wonderful to see is really the progression of how this conversation is taking place in the boardroom and around the world since that time. So we now have over 24 chapters working across 56 countries. And through these chapters, we reach hundreds of thousands of boards and their members to really, again, bring attention, awareness, tools, and understanding of how to raise the issue of climate change in board discussions to really ultimately achieve the objective that we're trying to drive, which is tackling climate change. So I hope that all of the sessions so far have been really helpful and insightful, and then this one will equally bring some insights to you that are helpful in the work that you're doing. So you'll hear my voice is a little bit raspy. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So hopefully I won't lose my voice completely through the session, but we'll see how it goes. But also with that, I can take the opportunity to introduce our two guests for this conversation, who will really be the ones kind of sharing their insights with you all. So first we have Rahul Bhardwaj, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Corporate Directors in Canada. And also we have Clarissa Linz, the founding partner of Catavento, and very much an experienced independent director, working with a number of boards, which she can talk a little bit more as she shares her perspectives. So I think the opportunity to have these types of conversations is really invaluable. It's getting into the kind of experience and nitty-gritty of these leaders that we have on the line with us here. And I want to start the conversation by asking each of you a little bit about your experience really in the role that you play on boards, or your experience working with boards, and where you see the agenda today. How are you seeing very much the evolution and adoption now of climate in these boardroom conversations, just to sort of kickstart with some of your personal experience and insights on this agenda. So maybe Clarissa, if I can start with you with your reflections, and I'll hand it over to you, Rahul.
So thank you very much, Antonia, and thank you for the invitation to share a few thoughts with you and with the audience today. It's my pleasure to be here with you and Rahul. In terms of experience at the boards, different board levels, Antonia, what I'd like to share with you is a perspective that varies according to geographies. So I have the benefit to serve on a board based in Europe, and on two boards based in Brazil, which is my home country. And given these, although the companies I serve at are global, I would say global providers of services and products all over the world, the fact that they are based either in Brazil or in Europe is absolutely critical to drive the speed of the conversation around climate at the board level. So the way I see it is that wherever there is more regulation and demand from society and investors, the easier it gets to have climate as a top priority for the full board, and not only for the Sustainability Committee. Here in Brazil, where conversation is around climate is not necessarily, I would say, as much as priority as it is in Europe or in the US, for instance. Even depending on the industry sector, I see that there is a willingness to respond to demand coming from investors mainly, also from employees, sometimes from consumers, but the speed and the amount of dedication is radically, I would say, different from where demand and regulation and public policies are much more oriented towards action from the corporate world. So I start with really this observation, Antonia, and very glad to come back to add insights later on.
No, thank you for that. I mean, I think some important, insights in terms of the drivers, right? So what is it really that's pushing, and how does that differ in different markets depending on the state of regulation and other factors really that are pushing action for companies on this agenda as well. Rahul, do you want to jump in here? And let me just also say to those watching, if you have questions throughout this session, please do post them in the chat. We will pick those up and involve them in the conversation here as well. And yeah, please take this opportunity that you have with these great leaders here. So Rahul, over to you.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks again, Antonia, for the invitation here. Great to speak with you all. I won't repeat what Clarissa said because I think she's absolutely right. We've got a very similar situation in Canada, and I would say in the Americas. But I would say there is a sense of building urgency, which is very interesting, because I think a part of the urgency is how do you balance corporate performance with climate positive outcomes. So if you can appreciate a country like Canada in particular, where you've got natural resource-based economy in many ways, but you've got 70% of the economy that's smaller, medium enterprise. You've got very different solutions and different pressures given the size of the company, given the sector that they're in. But to build on Clarissa's point, it's a rising priority, but we'll get into this a little bit more. But a part of the risk right now is, we've got a recession coming at us. We're coming out of COVID, inflation, interest rates. So the question is how does this maintain its priority amongst all of this? It's still oversight of governance of strategy, culture, and risk, but the context is shifting, and there are a lot of conflicting, I would say, priorities right now.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And maybe just to follow up on that, you talk about conflicting priorities, and I'd just be interested to hear your view on the extent to which the connection between these priorities is being seen, right? So of course, as you mentioned, there's an energy crisis, happening, but is there a recognition to your perspective on the connection with the long-term reality that is climate change? And there is certainly a link between what we're seeing in terms of the dependence and reliance on fossil fuel that has certainly sort of been part of spurring this energy crisis and conflict, with actually the reality of a long-term transition to one that is more climate friendly could not only prevent these short-term kind of crisis situations, but could also provide longer-term sustainability and benefit. But is that conversation and those connections between tackling this immediate crisis and sort of tackling immediate, let's say, call them immediate impacts, versus future-proofing for the long term, which could actually prevent some of those realities? Is that conversation happening at the board or not quite yet?
Sure. My own take on that is very much so, and if it mirrors a lot of the conversation around shareholders and stakeholders, and shareholders in particular, short-term shareholder interests versus long-term shareholder interests as well. So I hear a lot of the same language. If I try to get a little pithy about it right now, I think, boards are doing a good job, or a better job, of determining the impact of climate on the company. Now what they're being asked to do is focus more on the impact of the company on climate. And those are very different mindsets, but they have to come together at a certain point. And I think there's a willingness. I mean, these are thoughtful, reasonable individuals that are trying to do the best for the world and the planet as well as the company. But there are a lot of trade-offs, and it's very new. And of course, we'll get into the negative externalities on how do you actually internalize those at the end of the day. And they're looking for guidance there to have an open playing field to do so.
Clarissa, any thoughts on that track from you?
Yeah, Antonia, because I really believe that this apparent contradiction is really happening, because of course, unless you deal and you care about the short term, you won't be here for the long term. So the short-term concern is a must. Having said that, the fact that absolutely, all the companies I work with at least have established mid and long-term goals for 2030 and 2050 is a kind of a driver for our long-term thinking and future-proofing. So in a way, there's a necessity to deal with the short-term challenges when it comes to energy securities, for instance. But there is also the recognition that these could not prevent the company for investing more in R&D, for testing new technologies, and for really responding to those mid and long-term goals that it has committed to. So it's the tricky is really how to find the right balance. And I would say that the positive aspect is that nowadays boards are composed by multi-skills people. So the fact that there is someone, for instance, like me, who's more skilled in terms of the future of energy transition, climate change and its impact, together with some traditional financial experts, some ones that are more focused on culture and people, is, I would say, something beneficial for the company, because you have this, I would say, very positive tension, which is not a tension, but it is a kind of each one of us calling the attention of the full board to the necessity of dealing with short and long-term perspective.
Right. So I suppose in your case, it is sort of having, by de facto, having somebody like yourself as part of that board conversation does help to bring in that perspective, but also alongside the other diversity of perspectives actually that will be critical for the company to effectively future-proof itself as well. So maybe, I mean, just kind of coming back to one of the points that you mentioned, right? It's this notion that actually in different parts of the world, different companies are approaching this differently based on the drivers that are coming their way, be they regulation, pressure from their customers, pressure from the consumers, their employees, and that continues to be different, right? Yet there is increasing awareness and recognition. Now, I think, just interested to hear, what do you think is still missing, right? So what are those boards maybe that aren't quite there yet, missing be it in the business case or the understanding to go further, and how can this community help as well? And I think even in other parts of the world where maybe where that's less the challenge, it's safe to say that still not all boards are fully there yet either. So just, curious about your thoughts on that question. What's missing?
So to give you a very short answer, coming from an economist by background, I would say that what is missing is a price on carbon in all geographies. So this is a very simple answer to a broader question. And then all in all, I would say that what is missing is a leveling playing field when it comes to regulation and public policies that should drive all the region towards low carbon. So this is absolutely critical for the decision-making process, because we have, with, I would say, price on carbon and very predictable and clear regulation and public policies, these allow the board really to have a better assessment of risks and opportunities, to better do the business case, the management to do the business case without having such a span of assumption and hypothesis according to where it operates. So all in all, I would say that we should keep and expect more demand coming from investors. We also, as board members, have to pay very close attention to what is increasingly considered climate litigation cases directed to board members. And basically, this is due to the lack of clear public policies that are applicable worldwide.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, litigation is certainly on the rise when it comes to climate across the world, and is, arguably an important tool in accelerating action as well, where perhaps action isn't as far as it needs to go. I guess there's maybe a tension, right, in the narrative, because on one hand we say that boards should be thinking about climate for the sake of the company and for this, for the sake of resilience and risk mitigation. Regulation, of course, will fast track that immensely and will make it easier for companies to kind of fall in line. But if we wait for regulation, which we know we need, completely agree, a price on carbon, I'm an economist, will solve many things. It's unlikely to happen as quickly as we need action on climate today. So just that sort of tension between yes, we'll push for regulation, push for pricing, but how do we continue to ramp up the awareness that despite that, we still need boards to focus and take action on climate because it is a true risk to the business. So Rahul, I'd just be interested with that framing, you know, again, how do we resolve for that given the speed at which we need to act?
For sure. And one of the ironies built into your comment is over the last decade, you'll hear from boards saying, we're not just compliance organizations or entities. It can't be tick box. We actually have to have a focus on strategy. And now what we're hearing is that, you know, a part of solving this issue is in fact more regulation, which is going to create more compliance. But the point I think Clarissa was making, and I would agree, is you got to get that balance right. But I'm finding there's also more discussion around the opportunities within, you know, the climate change, and with, you know, we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US as something that's really going to spur a lot of investment, ironically, into climate change. So where are the opportunities now? And I think about ExxonMobil, where they had the proxy battle that went a little unusual, that they had shareholders that said there wasn't enough climate competency on the board that was seizing the opportunities inherent in this new economy that's going to be driven. So there's a part of this that's very much about risk to the company, risk to the planet. But I think those companies that are really looking at this as an opportunity perspective are really being able to bring that strategic mind frame or mindset into this while those regulatory, you know, the regulations are being built up to support that.
No, absolutely. And I guess just building on that, you know, how far do we think the recognition of that opportunity sits today? Now, you know, we put out a piece earlier this year, which was basically that. It was sort of the climate advantage, right? So how do you get ahead of the game in terms of investing in those opportunities, investing in that energy transition, looking at hydrogen, looking at, you know, now you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. If you were already kind of prepared a year ago to suddenly jump on some of the opportunities when it comes to industrial decarbonization, you're in a pretty good position now to actually unlock quickly the opportunities that are now available through public policy. How are you seeing the change, let's say, in recognition of the opportunity versus the risk as part of the narrative? So I don't know, Clarissa, if you want to start, and then Rahul, you.
Yeah, maybe Antonia, I think that one critical aspect is you know, identifying new products that you can provide to the market, and then could, you know, have a kind of what is called a green premium. So of course it depends on the industry you were at and the market that you're serving. But the perception that I have is as soon as the company is able really to identify a niche or market niche or possibility of really having a market premium, it turns into an opportunity more than a risk. And the second element I would add to that is the financial piece. So we've been talking a lot about climate finance and the extent to which the private sector, but also the public sector, is able to fund at risk new technologies, because at least when we think in terms of decarbonization, the industries that are hard to abate, such as cement, steel, petrochemicals, you still need those technologies to be deployed at scale and commercially viable. And sometimes you need public funding. So I would add another critical element for that to accelerate the pace of decarbonization would be an increased engagement coming from multilateral institutions, for instance, and this is at the center of the debate this week, was the role of the World Bank and other multilateral entities to provide and to direct fund to emerging economies, for instance. But this could be also the case in very established markets, such as the European or North American ones.
Yeah.
Antonia, I'd supplement that by saying, I'd bring in the very human dimension. By the way, I agree with what Clarissa put on the table, but the human dimension from this context, ICD in Canada, we've got 17,000 members from coast to coast to coast. We convene and we provide the forum for directors to have conversations precisely on issues like this. So on a very personal level, I think it's important that they seek permission to have these conversations with each other. So those that are actually been successful in navigating these opportunities and addressing them, they can build the narrative, they can build that muscle that they can take into the boardroom to say, you know, so-and-so company in our sector is doing it, or an adjacent sector, but they give themselves permission to see those opportunities a little differently. And that's why we exist as an association for directors, is to precisely have these types of conversations.
Absolutely. And maybe just kind of picking up on that thread, let's just say the kind of engagement and collaboration between directors to try to really learn, understand how to more effectively bring the case, let's say, into the board. Do you want to just maybe share a little bit about what you've seen in that context? Kind of, are there examples that you might share that worked incredibly well? Are there challenges that you've heard expressed that also needs to be addressed in terms of building that capability and competency as well through the work that you've done?
Sure. Just from my standpoint, just briefly, everybody's on the what, it's the how. And they're really looking for examples from others who've been able to do it, and you know how they actually manage these transitions given all of the competing priorities, recognizing it's not a one-size-fits-all. So I mentioned earlier, small and medium enterprise is 70% of the Canadian economy, roughly. The public companies have got a lot more capacity and resources, and they're in a regulated environment to begin with. So they've got a different set of issues they're dealing with. The smaller ones, when they're in a highly competitive state, they're trying to figure out how do we actually, you know, deal with this situation given all the other priorities. And it's extremely helpful for them to be connected with other companies and other leaders that have worked through it. So we actively try to promote those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Clarissa, I mean, you sit on a number of boards, so you might have experienced this firsthand, you know, what works well, what's been challenging, but also what insight you've gained by engaging with others on this issue.
So I would say that what works pretty well is really allowing the conversation. So something that Raul has mentioned, you know, just, you know, being together and sharing experiences, because usually board members also sit on different boards. So the fact that they are able to share their experience in another company is very beneficial. The other thing that I've seen as a very positive outcome as well is inviting some other board members to have a session with your board. So on a specific item, it could be decarbonization, it could be, you know, the strategy of renewable energy, you name it. But the fact that you are opening the floor to have, you know, 1 hour engagement with someone with a different experience, but that is also a board member in another company. So really allowing people to share different experiences from different industry sectors, I think, is absolutely critical, in addition to different geographies, because otherwise you'll be, you know, convinced that the only way to go forward is the way that is applicable to your country, which is absolutely not the case, because we all face, you know, the same challenge, which is how to accelerate the pace of the transition and how to allow the board to take the better decisions. And I just saw there's a question about data in the chat, and I will also like to bring to the table the very beneficial aspect of interacting with the audit committee members, because I sit on mostly on sustainability committees, but also on audit committee, and the fact that the audit committee is really looking to risks, and that now we have to deal with extreme weather event risks and physical risks coming from climate change, is something that is really enabling I would say a more positive conversation between those two committees, so that the board, when taking any decision, is better informed by having those two perspectives.
Yeah, maybe just for the benefit of the audience, the question that Clarissa was just referring to in the chat simply notes that climate and emission data is relatively new, right? I mean, when we say relatively, it's in the past sort of decade, 15 years, even sooner for some companies that they're collecting this data. And the question is really around the confidence in making predictions forward beyond sort of 5 to 10 years, right? And then having that help inform decision making of the board as well. I might just add a layer to that, is that, you know, as you said, there's kind of the audit committee side of it. But when we also look at kind of data, I would, argue and hear your perspectives on this, that it's not only about the corporate data in terms of the backwards and forwards data that one might design, it's also about the wider data set we actually have available, increasingly in terms of the climate impacts and where and how they will manifest, which is where also some of the risk modeling will come from, right, in terms of informing decision making. So I think there's just various data sources in a sense that are growing, but also can help inform decision making with a diverse set of perspectives as well. But Raul, what are your sort of thoughts on Clarissa's point, but also the question here?
Yeah, I think the data point's a really good one. I want to just drill down on the audit committee for just a moment too, because most people, when they think of the audit committee, it's in the traditional sort of risk side and value protection. But we know that the accounting profession in Canada, the CPA in particular, is moving from just value protection to value creation. They're trying to say, how does the profession actually advance performance and value creation? Much the same way internal auditors are doing that as well. So for those that are thinking about additional resources, particularly for public companies, the internal audit profession is one that's worth having a look at. If you don't already have that as a part of your large corporation, it's something worth looking at because it's an additional resource to help you deal with the data, to do the deep dives that you need to do, not only on the disclosure side, but particularly on the strategic side.
Super. So I think that's one good piece of advice that you shared there, Raul. I guess just building on that, other, let's say, pieces of advice that you might share with those watching and who might be engaging in functions on boards who are looking to kind of drive this perspective. What would be your kind of key areas of advice? So you gave one on audit, looking at the audit committee. Clarissa, any other thoughts from you?
Yeah, maybe the other thought, Antonia, is really spending time to understand the new data, because climate, as mentioned, is relatively new to a board's conversation, and data are not as straightforward as financial and economic data, and we are not used to look at these new data as we are used to look at EBITDA, revenues, and etc. And of course, they are 200 years behind economic and financial data compared to the person mentioned 10, but I would say, 3 decades of environmental and social and climate data. So it's uncomparable. And of course, we have a lot more to learn. And as we speak, the international guidance are being built. So the advice I would give, to all of us is really get engaged with the entities that are really establishing the guidelines that are to be applicable worldwide. So when you look to emissions, greenhouse gas emission, there is the GHG protocol, and nowadays SEC and the EU Green Taxonomy are both calling for more transparency and disclosure when it comes to your own emissions, the stated scope 1, to the emissions out of the energy that the company buys, so scope 2, but also to the emissions coming out of the whole value chain, whether you're sourcing or your clients, which is the scope 3. And there is a lot of uncertainty yet whether companies will be able to provide reliable and auditable data around, for instance, just only metrics relative to emissions. So there's a lot to be done, and what we should be doing as practitioners and board members is really to try to have a closer engagement and to influence so that we are comfortable with the data and the analysis provided out of this data.
No, that's great. I think I'll just also sort of prompt the audience while I have a moment to feel free to drop any other questions in the chat with a few more minutes in the session here as well, if you'd like to kind of throw anything on the table. And I think just the point about kind of the standards, we hosted a session a number of weeks ago during the UNGA in New York, and we had a number of the standard setters there, the ISSB, SBTI, and one of the points that came up, and also some of the audit firms. And so one of the points that came up was that it took something like 100 years actually to refine the financial system in terms of kind of the practices and the standardization. But the pressure that they're facing is they have maybe 5 years to kind of bring the climate data and reporting systems up to a point of standardization, as you noted as well. So I think it is, yes, it's absolutely the time to kind of engage. There's a huge amount happening there, but also recognizing that there's a lot that needs to be done quickly, but also can be learned from the systems that exist today in other parts of the, let's say, the data ecosystem that companies are part of as well. So Raul, what are your thoughts? What are your points of advice, let's say, for directors?
Use your time wisely. And that's a little prophetic, but I can't begin to tell you how many times I've heard from directors that doing more is just not an option. You know, this transition I spoke of earlier from a compliance board to a strategic board created a huge, number of issues for boards to create the space to have the strategic conversations they're wanting to have and not spending all their time on compliance. Now we're suddenly coming in face to face with what we're characterizing as an existential crisis in front of us. And the question is how much time do they have? Once we have more data, it's got to be interpreted. People have to internalize it, and it has to be linked to strategy. This is doing better, but I can't see how you can do better with the same amount of time. So it's getting more and more complex. So I think the basic rubric for boards, oversight of culture, strategy, and risk hasn't changed in terms of their duties. The context is shifting dramatically. We talked about the other priorities, but how do you actually get enough time to, educate? So board education on all of these new things, whether it's data or more broadly climate governance overall, that's quite a significant investment that directors are going to have to make, and corporations are going to have to support directors in that as well. So there are a lot of challenges out there, but I can see that there's also a real appetite to engage in this, particularly around climate.
Yeah, so there's more on their agenda. It's more complex, and now we're adding more on the agenda. So what kind of tools do you think will be helpful? What we need to kind of synthesize and reduce that complexity in order to help kind of make salient decisions without overwhelming with information. As you said, there's lots of different types of data. What kind of tools do you think either do exist and can be scaled, or don't exist and need to be created to support directors on this journey?
So top of my mind, and then I'd love to hear from Clarissa on this, is clearly the regulation that we spoke about earlier. That's going to give a lot of clarity to things like this. The disclosure, obviously extremely important, but I think at the front end, you won't be here surprised to hear me say, it's education. You really do have to invest in this. There's not going to be a 10-point handbook that's going to be handed out to everybody and simply implemented. Everything is going to come together. This is a serious matter, and we're talking about balancing some extremely important things, from corporate performance to obviously minimizing negative climate outcomes. It's not easy work. It's being done for the first time. There's going to be significant investment and engagement required on the part of individual directors and boards.
Clarissa?
So in addition to education, and I fully agree with Raul, and it's always a pleasure to learn more things, right? How at least it should be. But what I would add, what is doable at the board level, I would say is twofold. One is calling for more expertise, so you can have more session with external experts, in order to really have a specialized advice on a specific topic. But you can also take the advantage of getting into deeper discussion at some committee levels. So, and that's what happened, for instance, the board I serve at. We use the committees really to make some deep dives and then to better inform the board. So this is doable. I think nowadays every company, all the companies do have at least 2 to 3 specific committees composed by directors, but also by external experts sometimes. So, and it's very beneficial to have the time to go into deeper discussion with the management within the committee's working plan.
Super. What about incentives? Now, I think, kind of putting things on the agenda, giving data, inside information to make decisions is sort of one approach, but obviously kind of direct incentives that maybe drive a behavior in a certain direction can maybe take things further faster. What are your thoughts on incentives, and what types of incentives have you seen work here, Raul?
Well, we touched on earlier about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, and there's an enormous incentive being put on the table in terms of green industry going forward. So this is a place where, despite whatever your political leanings might be, it's important that government, you can recognize that government does play a potential role in stimulating the side. So that's one external. On the internal stuff, it's very interesting to see companies that witness other companies actually, changing strategies and creating more, shareholder wealth and better corporate performance through this, and actually seeing them embrace that. So I think that there are incentives built there that could be in that. In fact, that's not going to happen all the time, but I think good companies that can seize those opportunities would be very wise. And I go back to the ExxonMobil situation again. Once again, when you've got shareholders that are actively pushing you there, you can see that there are some incentives that investors can have to really push companies to seize the opportunities of the emerging green economy.
Clarissa, go for it. And the other dimension here is incentives in the board and company itself, right? So there's the external drivers, indeed, which are great, but just also reflecting on the board incentives, just to throw that into the mix.
So I was going to respond, Antonia, giving the perspective of incentives given to the management through, compensation. That was one of the aspects of your question. And I would say, again, coming to the need to balance short-term and long-term, but there's a way really to include within the incentive, the short-term and the long-term incentives, the metrics in which we all trust, board and management, but the metrics that really reflect the long-term commitments towards climate change, towards, biodiversity, gender diversity, you name it. And this is, I understand this is beneficial for alignment of, all the C-level, but also this is a way really to proof point that you are in the right direction. That no matter, the extent of the short-term crisis, you're still looking to the long-term, and you're still able really to retain people based on the long-term commitments the company made. So in terms of incentives to the board and to the management, I believe that introducing what is called ESG metrics, but choosing the ones that are really more material to your company is a very critical aspect.
Sure. I see we have another question here in the chat in just a few minutes to go. We'll take another question, and then I'll ask you also for some closing reflections and advice for everybody on the line here. But the question in the chat here looks specifically at sector agreements. So do you foresee sector agreements on thresholds that bring industries to within truly planetary limits, and the extent to which the boards are aware of kind of thinking about this type of a ceiling, should it evolve? I suppose it's a little bit linked with kind of the work that's happening in designing science-based targets. I would bridge, but yeah, what would be your sort of answer to that question? Sort of thresholds for sectors in terms of planetary boundaries, and is this a conversation that's entering boardrooms really?
Oh, if you're asking me, the notion of planetary anything tends to get people a little confused, I would think, because there are the obvious limitations on that. I can't see a lot of boards or director conversations. I mean, I've heard it come up, but more from a frustration standpoint, recognizing that if it takes those type of limitations, that's going to be very, very difficult to do. I think more of the conversation is, what can we do within the boundaries of reasonable corporate performance? And there's a real desire to do that. There's also the notion that you don't want to wait for something too global to occur, just given the nature of how long that would take to actually be done.
Yeah, Clarissa?
Yeah, I fully agree with Raul. We at the board level, we have to, of course, understand the broader context. But at the end of the day, what is into our reach of action to implement, and how is it perceived as good performance versus bad performance? And this is absolutely critical, because you have to have to business case, you have to be a good performer in order to be compliant performer as well. And of course, if you're in the cement industry, the steel industry, again, the oil and gas industry, you are absolutely aware of the limitation in terms of emission that you have to abide for, but it has to be translated into your specific and corporate goals. And this is absolutely doable nowadays. So what I would definitely encourage any board members serving on any of those companies is really understand your company's target compared to, of course, your peers, and the extent to which your targets are aligned with Science-Based Target Initiative, for instance, which is nowadays one very important global reference when it comes to sectoral analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just building on that as well, just bringing in some of the work and experience that we have is the kind of disaggregation of this is critical, right? So going from 1.5 degrees to what is the roadmap actually for an industry to decarbonize, not by 2050, but year on year to 2030 and beyond, and providing a clarity of that transition roadmap is so critical. And then that transition roadmap is sort of translating also into a standardized approach like a science-based target that companies can adopt, so that you can then have a very pragmatic conversation. And we've seen this in certain companies to then see, look, for example, by 2030, we know that for shipping, for example, there's a massive need on one hand, but also opportunity to invest in things like ammonia, e-methanol. And we see the leading companies sort of getting ahead of that game and actually starting to invest, or things like green steel, Volvo. There's actually an over demand now for green steel, and the leaders are actually starting to realize that's where this agenda is going, because they see their roadmap, they know where they need to go, and they're moving first, let's say, and that's why we call our initiative the First Movers Coalition. We need these companies to move first, but they can do that if they have those pathways. But it's true, you need the standardization and indeed the ability to bring a framework like that presents a pathway and an opportunity that can be translated certainly into, let's say, the business language, because it's the planetary boundary, I think was your point. That's a hard concept, but if we can translate the concept into something very pragmatic, it's a different dialogue. I'm just quickly reviewing this last question. We can maybe, it's quite long, so I'm going to just take 30 seconds to look at it quickly. Are boards paying attention to capital allocation and regulation to ensure that the systems lead to global capital being allocated first to initiatives that have the largest impact on emissions? It's quite a broad question. Given that we only have 2 minutes left, maybe what I'll do is ask you to kind of share your quick reflection on that, but couple it maybe with a closing reflection that you'd like to share with the participants of this session in closing as well. So Clarissa, if you want to go first.
So in terms of the short answer to this last question, capital allocation versus impact on emissions, the good positive aspect is that we have tools to do that, and the what is called the marginal abatement cost curve is something that does that, and it is already used by I would say the decarbonization teams and informed to the board members in many situations. So this is doable, and I would, of course, if it's not done, a good way of having these information is asking it to be done. On my final comments, I really thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation today. In terms of, I would say, urgency of the matter, it's clear for me that the conversation around climate is one of top priority, I would say, worldwide, even though whenever you have clear public policies and regulation in place, it is absolutely critical to give a sense of a speed, scale that we all need.
Thank you, Raul.
Sure, I can build on that just a little bit. I think Clarissa captured it very well in terms of internal capital allocation within the organization. More broadly, depending on the jurisdiction, corporate leaders have influence and are in contact constantly with policymakers around how to do it. If the question's extended to more planetary things, well, we sort of touched on that already. That's a tough one for anybody to get their head around. But these are early days in the conversation, and I realize we have to make a lot of progress very quickly, but these are early days in the conversation, so momentum can certainly pick up. At least that's the hope. And I'd say this is a part of why CGI is so important, at least from my perspective, and why in Canada we're Chapter 0, we're so pleased to be. It's important to inspire directors, give them permission to actually have these conversations and to educate, and above all, to convene. So all of the convening work that CGI has been able to do around corporate leadership around the planet, bring people together to be having these conversations, as I say, early stages of the journey, but a very important starting point.
Super. Thank you, Raul, and thanks to you both, really, Clarissa and Raul, for sharing your perspectives in this quick session here. Obviously, there's a lot of ground that you covered, so appreciate you taking that time, and also thanks very much to the CGI Secretariat for pulling this session together. I've also just been asked to mention to all of you on the line here the next sessions that are coming up. So there's a session run by Chapter 0 Brazil, an overview of the Brazilian Climate Change Collective book. And secondly, Chapter 0 Mexico, entitled From the Glasgow Declaration to Climate Action Towards a Net Zero Nature Positive Tourism Industry in Latin America. So both of those are starting on the hour, so you have a few minutes maybe to take a break. But in closing, again, thank you, Raul, Clarissa, for joining this session, and I hope that everybody found it helpful and insightful.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.